Ladies and gents, welcome to episode 10 of Shop Talk with MADDOG. And joining me today is another illustrious member of the renowned Tailhook Association and our second Tomcat Rio on the show. Sorry to the Hornet Mafia. Ward Mooch Carroll, USN, retired. Mooch, dude, welcome to the show, bro.
Mad Dog, it is great to see you. It's only been a few weeks since we saw each other out in Reno, and it's always a pleasure to see you out there. But I'm very happy to be on the show.
So, dude, you've done podcast interviews before. Let's start with the usual intro questions. Where you're from, what got you into aviation. Obviously, I know this because I've been a longtime subscriber of your channel, but which we'll get to in a minute. But tell me a bit about yourself.
So I was born into a Marine Corps aviation family. My dad was a Marine Corps attack pilot, A4s and A6s,
Hmm.
and so I moved all over the place. I lived in 10 different houses from the time I was born until I went away to the Naval Academy.
Hmm.
So everywhere from Orange County, California, where Marine Corps Air Station El Toro used to be,
Mm-hmm.
to we lived in the Netherlands for 3 years. My dad was the assistant naval attaché there. To
Mm-hmm.
places like Traverse City, Michigan, where we lived near my grandparents when my dad was overseas for a year. And then I went to high school in Havelock, North Carolina, which is adjacent to the Marine Corps Air Station at Cherry Point, where I lived. I lived on base at Cherry Point. So
Mm.
obviously, being around my dad and his buds and airplanes, watching fly-ins and listening to them talk around the barbecue on Friday evening or whatever was a huge influence on me. It seemed like
Mm.
they were having fun. Obviously, that's a exciting life. I loved the vibe of guys in a squadron,
Mm.
and some of the junior officers in my dad's squadron when I was in high school, and that was VMA All Weather 121, the Green Knights, who now fly the F 35B.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, and we're talking, this is the mid 1970s, they flew the A6E Intruder. So some of his junior officer pilots were Academy grads, and they had some cool stories. And I didn't have any better ideas, really. I'm like Richard Gere, an officer and a gentleman. I had nowhere else to go, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I just decided I wanted to go to the Naval Academy, having never been there.
Mm.
And it took me 2 tries. I had to go to a year of prep school. My candidate multiple wasn't good enough to get in right out of high school. So I went to another year, basically, of high school, what we call
Mm.
a postgraduate year down in Harlingen, Texas, at a prep school called the Marine Military Academy, which at the time seemed like a real drag as all my classmates from high school were going to college. And here I'm going to high school again. Right.
Mm.
But in hindsight, I'm very glad I did that because it allowed me to have a year away from home, cut the apron strings, cut my hair because I had like Bjorn Borg long hair. I
Yeah.
was a tennis player in high school. And so I cut my hair and I was getting, drilled by retired Marine gunny sergeants down there in Harlingen, Texas. And by the time I got to the Naval Academy for plebe year, I was emotionally and physically prepared for it. So went through the Naval Academy. At the end of that, you have to choose a service selection.
Mm-hmm.
My eyes were not 2020 by the time I graduated. Uh, I'm not sure why, probably because I studied or just it was already uh, a problem for me. I had astigmatism that got worse during my time at the academy. So it was like, okay, if you want to fly, there's only one option, and that's naval flight officer.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad was like, that's a bad idea because he flew with BNs in the A6. And, I talked later with the BNs he flew with. And apparently my dad wasn't a whole lot of fun to fly with if you were a BN because he's a single seat guy, right? An A4 guy. He doesn't quite know what to do with the other guy in the airplane.
Right.
So his advice was do something else, go ships, go subs, which really wasn't an option for me, or
Yeah.
join the Marines as a infantry guy.
Yeah.
And so I did the Marine option cruise, went to Hawaii, got an F4 ride in the back of a VMFA 235 F4J. And that
Mm-hmm.
was it. I was in love
Yeah.
with the idea of being a Rio.
Mm.
And so that was where I forged the idea. So, service selected naval flight officer at service selection on second semester of my senior year at the academy, and then wound up going to flight school. Took to it, loved TAC air, loved strapping into ejection seat, loved the feeling of G. Was very at home there. Could keep my wits about me, talking on the radios and figuring out navigation and directing the pilot where to go. So I did well, and I did well enough to get my choice, and my choice was the Rio pipeline.
Right.
So got through that, got my NFO wings. At that time, there were two choices because they'd stopped sending Rios to F4s. Uh, and so it was either go to Miramar or go to Oceana. And so I'm kind of an East Coast kind of guy.
Hmm.
So many of my fellow Rios who got their wings when I did wanted to go to Miramar. So Oceana was available. So went to Oceana, went through the RAG, was the top scope in my RAG class, something I'm very proud of. And as a
Hmm.
result, was a first round draft pick, as it were, to go right on cruise. So I was in VF 32, the Swordsman, legendary squadron, just got back from cruise on Ike. But also, you probably know MADDOG. That was the squadron that Thomas Hudner was in, and Jesse Brown in the Korean War. That was,
Yep.
you know, documented in the movie Devotion that came out a couple of years ago. So it's a great storied squadron flying the F-14A aboard the USS Independence, a very old aircraft carrier. So went on cruise, went through the Suez Canal for the first time, did a lot of cool operations in the North Arabian Sea. This is before aircraft carriers went into the Gulf proper.
Hmm.
And got back. We switched over to Kennedy and did a second cruise on Kennedy that was just a med cruise. So basically, that's the path that got me into the fighter community, and that's where I started my active duty life.
Right. And you were mentioning the swordsman, and I was trying my best not to interrupt you and yell "Gypsy roll" as loud as humanly possible.
Right, right. That's still something that when two gypsies get together, right? And I'm going to the Oceana Air Show in a couple of weeks. We have a booth there, so if anybody out there is thinking of going, please say hi to us down there. And there'll be a lot of gypsies there. There's always a gypsy reunion during the Oceana Air Show, and they are always saying gypsy roll. So, yep, that is a thing.
Yep. But there's something I wanted to touch on. It's more in the sense of, we've heard, I interviewed Bio a while back. I'm not sure if you heard that podcast. It was a good time, very good time. Uh, and basically, the thing I want to touch on is we talked a bit about everything from the A model side and the OG9. Um, but the thing I want to touch on is what are some of the Rio like crew coordination, pilot responsibility, crew coordination with the pilot type thing? Because I come from a very single seat mentality. I grew up with the Canadian branch of the Hornet Mafia. So our philosophy is very single seat. Who needs a backseater? It's extra weight in the back, right? So let's talk a bit about what the crew brings to the fight versus the single seat mentality for a minute here.
Great question. So, back in the late 60s, when the F 14 was being fielded,
Mm,
um, technology was such that pilot didn't have all of the sensor fusion and stuff in front of him that a Super Hornet or an F-35 pilot has now.
right.
So the F4 was a tandem seat airplane, and the Rio was necessary in basically all the missions they did there,
Mm,
air to air, air to ground, so forth and so on. And so the Navy and the Air Force, but we're talking Navy here, was bullish on the idea that you needed two guys in the airplane that was going to replace the F4. So they created this tandem seat airplane. So the original role of the Rio was to run the radar and to be sort of the tactician for the airborne picture. So basically, we would direct the intercepts, we would prosecute the missile solutions, we would tell the pilot where to steer the airplane, what altitude to go to shoot the Phoenix missiles. And then if it got to a visual arena, because your missiles didn't hit or there were more airplanes you were going against than you could tackle with either the Phoenix or the medium range Sparrow missiles, then you'd get into the visual. So now in a dogfight, the Rio's responsibility is to look where the pilot isn't. So if he's going after somebody in front of you, trying to sweeten up a shot for either a Sidewinder heat seeking missile or a guns shot, then the Rio should be looking behind the airplane to make sure that somebody else isn't rolling in on you. So many times I was able to save us in a training environment by calling the pilot off as he's trying to prosecute a bandit at just the right time to make sure that we didn't get shot as we were trying to shoot somebody.
Hmm.
So the way I frame it, Mad Dog, is you're both a weapons system operator and a co-pilot.
Mm.
So the co-pilot duties also extend to when you're around the aircraft carrier launching or landing, you are monitoring airspeeds, altitudes. You fly with the same guy, so generally you know his trends as he's trying to land on the aircraft carrier. So you can kind of be mentor, coach, keep him out of trouble, watch when he's about to either pull power or overcorrect or whatever. So my responsibility once the radar is in standby is to be a co-pilot and get us on and off the ship safely. So I enjoyed both of those roles. I think most Rios would tell you that we're frustrated pilots, and I think that's what makes us effective Rios. You know, we're
Mm.
we're always plugged in, we're always aware. We're not just sitting there waiting to get driven somewhere. Um, we're always an active part of the crew.
Right. So the other thing I wanted to touch on was, you've covered the Kara Holt-Green accident, right?
Yeah.
And the thing I want to touch on is a bit of the Swiss cheese model of that accident, in the sense that, why didn't the Rio command eject right after the engine stalled? They knew they weren't getting out of it. Once they rolled, they should have punched out.
Well, he did actually,
Mm.
right? I think, and that's nightmare fuel for a Rio,
Yeah.
right? So if you see an airplane settling at the ramp, you see the ball going red. At what point do you initiate ejection to prevent you guys from getting killed? And if you did it wrong and the airplane landed, that would make you look pretty bad, right? I mean, you
Right.
just wasted an F-14. So, same drill here. You know, if you and I, as you know, I did that episode. It was my first 1 million view episode, by the way, and
Yeah.
remains my highest viewed episode with over 4 million views. Um, so you look at how quickly that airplane goes into that roll, and the Rio initiates ejection as soon as it was practicable.
Yeah.
He's giving Kara the benefit of the doubt that she's going to be able to manage the single engine situation. And then, unfortunately, because it takes, you know, almost a second for both seats to get out of the airplane, that was a lifetime in her case. So he got out, barely got a shoot as he hit the water, sustained some injuries, and the airplane was inverted by the time, uh, you know, her initiation started. I don't think she even got out of the airplane.
No.
She was found in the airplane.
Yeah.
So he did. I again around low altitude around the ship. These decisions have to be made. So I think if he had initiated ejection any sooner, critics may have said that he did it too soon.
Mm.
Right. So it's a tough call. That's a tough call. And as I look at that plat tape over and over again, um, I think he's lucky he got out at all.
Yeah.
And I've seen other ejections where, if they didn't do it right when some of my mishap, highlight episodes, I'm sure you've seen, you can see that in other
Yeah.
types of airplanes, whoever initiates ejections, they do it just in time. And in some cases, you can see they did it a hair late. And in that case, somebody's not going to survive the crash.
Mm. Because it's well known that the Tomcat was a bit of a handful behind the boat. I've talked to many people about it, mutual friends of ours. The great Nasty Manazer who snuck up on me because I just completely forgot about SA. I was about 3 beers in, and Nasty sneaks up on me, right? And, everybody loves Nasty as a sidebar, but
Yeah.
pardon me.
No, he knows. Yeah. So the A particularly
Yeah,
was a tough airplane,
yeah,
pre-digital flight controls. There's a lot
yeah,
going on, you know. So the F-14 big airplane, 65-ish feet wingspan. So every correction you would make required another correction with another control surface,
right.
you know. And so if you made a lineup correction using lateral stick, the nose would wander off the opposite way. So you had to feed in rudder coordinated with stick. And, you know, there was always the fear that you would have a compressor stall, which Kara had at perfectly the wrong time.
Yeah,
And in that case, you have to get the angle of attack under control. And if you don't, the airplane's going to snap roll the opposite way you input stick, which is what happened. So, yes, well known. The airplane was a lot to bring aboard. You had to be ahead of it. You had to kind of do a little bit of voodoo as a pilot to stay ahead of it. And any pilot, any Tomcat pilot will tell you, like Nasty or anybody else I've had on the channel over the years, will tell you it was a huge challenge. Now, the B with the F-110 engines, and once we got digital flight controls, it got easier. But it's certainly easier to land a Legacy Hornet, and then much easier to land a Super Hornet and an F-35. And that's because they were better designed in terms of dirty configuration around the boat. And further, the last cherry on top here is that, um, you know, the PLM, right? The
yeah,
precision landing mode, which basically is uh, automatic landing, where the only thing the pilot has to worry about when he has PLM selected is where he puts the flight path director, and everything else the computer is doing. So, yes, that's a long answer, Mad Dog, for it was a tough airplane to bring aboard. And unfortunately, a confluence of circumstances uh, got Kara in a bad situation that resulted in her losing her life.
yeah. And there's that's the other plat tape accident that lives rent free in my head. It's not just Kara, but also Planet Clar.
Yeah.
Planet lives rent free in my head. The the LSO was screaming at him for power, literally screaming at him.
Okay.
I'm
Yep.
sure you've seen the tape, right?
Yes. Yes. For
And
sure.
it just goes to show how difficult and how dangerous our, even though I'm a civilian, I'm using the term here, how difficult and dangerous our business is, right?
Amen. You know it.
And there's something I wanted to touch on. Oh yes, speaking of difficult and dangerous, what was your scariest moment in the jet? What was your moment in the jet where you're like, I'm not sure if I'm gonna make it out of this?
So a number of those come to mind. Almost had a midair over Morocco
Mm,
during an exercise called African Eagle with an Air Force, a United States Air Force F-15.
mm,
Close enough that I could hear the burners and felt the thump as we went by. So that my life flashed before my eyes.
mm.
And then the most scary is a flight in the North Atlantic uh, in very rough seas, north of the Shetland Islands, and was convinced that we weren't going to get aboard. The deck was pitching. Our good friend Hoser Miller was the
Mhm.
controlling LSO using the manual system because the automatic system can't keep up when the sea state is that high. And so that day, I was convinced I wasn't going to make it.
Yeah.
You know, um, and so Um, yeah, that would be my answer. Was that was absolutely the scariest flying I ever did.
Mm. But what was the most fun flying you've ever did? Because I've heard stories from my Canadian Hornet bros of beating tomcats into the ground. And what was the most fun you've had in the jet? Let's do the opposite question now.
Yeah, no, good. Another good question. So the most fun was during what we used to call FARP, Fleet Fighter Air Readiness Program.
Hmm.
So you're shore based. The jets are slick, no tanks, no rails, and you're fighting against the aggressors, which include Top Gun guys, the visiting Top Gun guys that come out to Oceania
Hmm.
to fight against you. So this is something you do between deployments. So these flights last half hour, 45 minutes, and you go out there, you turn and burn until you're at bingo state. You come back, you debrief in the tax trailer, just like you see in the movie Top Gun. And so when those flights go well, meaning the Rios have the intercept suitcase, you direct the pilots to missile solutions, you get to the merge, whoever's left, pilots do their thing with the help of Rios now acting as co-pilots and mop up whoever's left in the dogfight. So let's just say it's a 2v4.
Hmm.
So both Tomcats have multiple kills and all the bandits are dead. You come back, do the debrief. Top Guns and all the guys debriefing are happy with your conduct and all the tactics you used. Then you go to the club and have a beer.
Yeah.
That doesn't get any better. That's one of those I can't believe I get paid to do it kind of days. And so those would happen pretty frequently, uh, when you were home doing uh, dogfighting training.
Hmm.
That would also be the case when I was in F-14 training squadron, the RAG instructor. We'd go down to Key West.
Hmm.
So that's a great place to operate, a fun place, always sunny. The warning areas are right there offshore once you take off. So there's not a lot of transit time that you have to worry about and waste gas. So you'd be down there with students who are going to the fleet squadron or people who are coming back through the RAG to get refreshed on their way to go be commanding officers of squadrons or air wing commanders or whatever. So same drill, you know,
Right.
short hops, cool dogfighting, and then you got to hang out on Duval Street and tell tall tales. So that's as good as it gets in terms of the business. The other thing that comes to mind is we had a low level route that we did over Oman
Mm.
that had a thing called Star Wars Canyon. Now I know there are other Star Wars canyons around the world, including one in the United States, but this one is right out of Star Wars, the movie, right? And so you would jump into that thing, and depending on who you were flying with, it was either thrilling or nerve wracking.
Right.
Generally, the guys I flew with, I trusted, but you would do this, dive into this thing, and go, carve along the walls, and have this really fun, thrilling low level route. So that was also a really, really fun event.
Yeah. Low levels are always fun. The next
Yep.
thing I want to touch on is the naval aviation documentary from 1986 and its sequel of the same that we have discussed at length on other shows. But the thing I want to touch on is that scene in the second documentary in the sequel where Rooster is like, how do I start this thing? There's so many circuit breakers back here, and Mav just replies with, "Well, it's easy. That's your dad's department. I don't know."
Yeah, that did my heart good. That was as real pilot as it gets, you know. And that's because the military advisors, guys we know,
Yeah,
particularly in this case, Chaser Keithley,
yeah,
uh, were Rios, right? And so circuit breakers, there are some in the front seat, but there's hundreds in the back seat. You're like a church organist with these rows of circuit breakers. So the trick or the sort of running, fix it in the F-14 was just cycle the circuit breaker. And a lot of times it would surprise you how many times that actually fixed the problem,
yeah.
you know? And so, um, yeah, I love that exchange. First, it was kind of funny the way that Rooster goes, "This is so old," right? When he gets in the airplane. I'm thinking, bro, that was state of the art back in my day, right? But you can get it if you look at the back seat of, I mean, pick your fourth, fifth gen airplane these days.
Yeah,
A Strike Eagle, an F-18F, whatever. Those are MFDs, glass. You know, everything's HOTAS. That wasn't the F-14,
yeah,
right? And steam gauges. I mean, we got the Gucci 10 by 10 display when we incorporated Lantern, the precision air to ground pod, towards
yeah,
the end of the life of the F-14. But beyond that, it was again 1960s technology. But it worked, right? And we knew the tricks to make it work. Months and months at sea. God bless the maintenance effort. But I love that line. To your point, that was a very cool line. Did my heart good.
yeah. I got a good laugh out of it because I went to see it with episode one's guest, Rose Kissman. I'm not sure if you listened to that episode, but he's a former Canadian Hornet guy, and he rags on Tomcats all the time, even though he was a test guy. So he had the good fortune of flying the D way back when. Um, and the thing I'm bringing up here is, let's just take a minute and talk about. I know it's kind of segue, but not really. With with the AIM 174 Bravo coming online, right? Are we basically seeing a rebirth of the outer air battle and fleet defense concept as we know it? Are we seeing basically, for lack of a better term, Phoenix 2.0? Is that what we're seeing?
I think that's a good way to put it. The speeds are going to be, you know, 5x faster. But yeah, this is range is a thing again. We sacrificed the kind of numbers we were used to during the life of the Tomcat and the outer air battle because the threat changed. Once the Soviet Union collapsed and we weren't worried about bears and badgers shooting AS-4 air to surface missiles at the carrier strike group,
Yeah,
and now we're into these asymmetric wars and the other things that we did post 9/11, the need for the long stick kind of waned. But as we pivot to the peer conflict that is US versus China potentially,
yeah,
and they are developing, if not have already fielded, hypersonic weapons, then suddenly you're left realizing that, okay, Arleigh Burke point missile defense is not going to hack it against a target moving that quickly.
right,
It's the way that those systems work can't track a Mach 5 weapon. So we're like, oh, geez, we have some development to do. So our test and evaluation commands, our system commands set to work, not just fixing the small boys, the cruisers and destroyers, but also the air platforms. And so in this case, we're talking about the Super Hornet. You modify a standard missile basically so that it
yeah,
can be carried on a Super Hornet. And now you have ranges and speeds that start to be able to defend the carrier against this threat. So this is the iterative nature of warfare, right? And so
right,
it's what you're seeing is uh, the U.S. machine, the defense procurement machine, adapting and developing systems against the threat as it becomes known. So we'll see what the AIM 174 is capable of, but it's pretty cool and it does my heart good to see that we're already thinking in these ways and we're not just sort of sitting back and going, well, maybe when we get, you know, NJAD or whatever, we'll be able to counter it. But right now we're at risk. We don't accept that. And so this is what the guys at Pax River and Edwards Air Force Base and other centers of excellence do to
right,
make sure that we're, always in the fight.
right. And there was, as I recall correctly, what was I getting at? My brain just shorted out. 1 second. Um, where was I? Oh yeah. I remember now. So, we were talking about AIM 174 Bravo, and I'm just curious as to what, you know, yes, Bravo is going to be good for the outer air battle role, but will and sidewinders still have a place, considering what we've seen in the Red Sea with the Houthis and the anti-drone, you know unmanned vehicle mission, right?
Yeah.
Is AMRAAM still going to have a place
Yes. The
for?
short answer, Mad Dog, is yes. Right. So you're long, just like with the Phoenix,
Right,
you want defense in depth.
right,
You want a long stick, you want a medium stick, you want a short range, and then a very short range capability.
right.
Right. So you get leakers, missiles malfunction. You better be able to handle the next range. And this is our BVR timeline and all the other stuff that you train to when you're working with Top Gun or any other air to air center of excellence is what's your defense in depth strategy? And
Mm,
so the short answer is yes, there will always be a place for an AMRAAM and a Sidewinder, not to mention a gun. Don't
yeah.
forget a gun.
Which is why I've never understood why the Growler doesn't pack a gun when the Foxtrot model Super Hornet does. I mean, the U.S. Air Force equivalent, the CJ, packs a gun. The loss of the gun on the Growler is a bit of a odd decision, to say the
Well,
least.
I don't know if it's a CG issue, if it's a real estate issue.
Mm,
Um, I don't know. I mean, they got a kill during the Ike deployment with a
yeah.
winder. Um, I'm not sure if it was a ballistic missile or a drone that they shot down.
Mm,
So it does have, air to air capability. But
right.
you bring up a good question. My guess would be as they were designing the airplane, you have a finite amount of real estate, you have a finite, CG limit. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. The question is, how is Hawkeye gonna, because are we gonna see almost Hawkeye being a massive AUG 9, for lack of a better term, where the Hornet's just gonna loose off a 174 Bravo, and then the Hawkeye's gonna take over the data link? Is that what we might see?
Yes, yes, and not just Hawkeye.
Mm,
It could be an Air Force AWACS. It could be an F-35 from any service over the horizon. This
yeah,
is the very cool data sharing that you can do now that it allows you all kinds of fusion that was impossible back in my day.
right.
Game changer.
Yeah. And speaking of fusion and inter-service cooperation, did you ever operate with the Canadians, and do you have any good stories from operating with us?
I landed at Goose Bay one time um, during the winter, so it was pretty cold. I was actually in a C9. It was when I was an A to a 3-star, and we are coming back from Europe.
Yeah.
So I never did an exercise against the Canadians. I've operated with Canadian ships,
Mm,
in various joint arenas, both Persian Gulf and the Med. Uh,
yeah.
always found you guys to be amazingly professional and have super cool attitudes, and so always a pleasure to work with Canadian forces. But my experience is somewhat limited in terms of I've never flown a CF-18. I've never operated uh, out of a Canadian base or done an extended exercise at Cold Lake or anywhere else. I have landed there one time, like I said.
That's because the funny thing I bring up, the reason I brought up the Canadians is partly because I want to touch a bit. I know I've covered on it on other episodes to a certain extent, but I want to touch a bit on fighter pilot humor and the humor of the Ready Room and the camaraderie of the Ready Room and why it's so special. Because it's funny because one of Rose's favorite jokes back when Maple Flag was still a thing. If one of our European partners showed up, he would take an overlay of the Cold Lake weapons range and put it on top of the overlay of whatever European country and say, hey, look, yes, our weapon range has a bigger area than your entire country. Right?
Yeah,
So,
right.
so let's talk a bit about the culture of the Ready Room and what makes it so special. Where as an outsider, not me, obviously not me, but like as an outsider, it's so difficult to understand, you know, why despite all the high pressure, we act like 12-year-olds on the ground, but in the air we're complete consummate professionals. Does it have something to do with compartmentalization? Is it just the way the fighter force is as an institution? Like what is it? Why is fighter culture the way it is the point I'm making.
Um, uh, I think it's two things at once.
Mm,
First is the training.
yeah,
Um, Second, it's the personalities of those who are drawn to the business.
yeah,
And you know this better than anybody from all the guys that you know and are friends with.
yeah,
Um, and so I think it's the combination of those two things.
right,
And every type of airplane has a different personality. Um, Helicopters, Hawkeyes, prop planes, V-22s, and the fighter community. And then even within the fighter community, there was, Hornet guys, Tomcat guys, uh, different personalities, different, and that's what made it fun, right?
right,
The airplane itself kind of had a personality as an inanimate object because of
right,
the way that we fought it and what that yielded in terms of our personalities. Having a Rio in the ready room, if you look at an F-18F squadron compared to an F-18E squadron, and I just saw this on Truman a few months ago,
yeah,
there's a different vibe, right? Having a
totally,
Wizzo in the mix brings a different calculus, different personality than if you don't. But this is what
exactly,
we celebrate. That one's not better than the other. It's just like you love what you do, and so that yields this camaraderie, this spirit that makes the job more than just a job.
exactly. I mean, not to what happens in the admins stays in the admins, as we say. But I saw this firsthand this year, like 2 weeks ago, right? CAG 5
Yes.
came down from Japan and we had a blast, right?
Yep.
So
Right.
going back to flying for a minute here, um, as a BF, I know Nasty and I have talked about it. I know Bio and I have somewhat touched on it, but your thoughts on the Tomcat as a BFM platform?
In the hands. Okay. So an F-14B or D,
Mm,
right? So the F-110 motor,
mm,
in the hands of uh, a capable crew, uh, could hang with anybody,
mm,
right? And so the Tomcat had a great turn rate, had great nose authority at slow air speeds, um, was capable of 1-to-1 thrust to weight without tanks or rails.
mm,
So formidable BFM platform. The Where it lacked was the roll rate wasn't awesome compared to some airplanes because the fuselage is 25% of the lift, and so it didn't roll that fast, but it could pitch. Because the horizontal stabs are as big as an A4's wing. You
mm.
know, so it had uh, capabilities, and in the hands of a good pilot and Rio to back him up, it could hang with any airplane.
Right. And since we're both musicians, the next thing I want to touch on is I know I've kind of touched on it on other interviews, but I think this works for you pretty well. Music and fighter culture. What makes it so special, right? Why why is it that fighter aviations we have the rowdiest, raunchiest drinking songs known to man, and to this day we still mostly get away with it? Why is it that fighter aviation is the way it is when it comes to music? And why is it that we hold it so dear and will defend it against any foreign enemy, so to speak?
So I think it's like we're talking about, um, with who winds up being in the business
Right.
is it's just an extension of our personalities,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's just kind of how we roll, you know. And so um, it's funny because in my first tour, when we were back from my second deployment,
Mm.
this is 1987. We're just cooling our heels, looking through the paper back when people used to read a physical newspaper, and we're
That's
like,
okay.
so what bands are coming to town,
Mm.
right? And this is in Virginia Beach.
Right.
And it turns out Motley Crue is coming. They're doing
Mm.
the Girls, Girls, Girls tour.
Mm-hmm.
And so we called the promoter, which was Cellar Door Productions, and we said, hey, Fighter Guys here. We'd like to give the band a tour of the squadron and take them into the simulator.
Right.
And the guy, his name was Bobby Malati.
Mm.
He was the heavy metal account guy, hard rock
Mm.
guy. And he's like, oh, it's an interesting question. I'll relay it to the band or, interesting offer. He goes, let me ask, why do you choose this particular band? I'm like, well, because when you get serious about it, you know, although we like the soundtrack to Top Gun, that
Mm.
doesn't really capture it. It's not so much Kenny Loggins as it is Motley Crue, you know,
Yeah.
and Guns N' Roses. That energy is more in keeping with what it's like to actually be on the flight deck or fly an airplane, a
Right.
tactical jet. And so he loved that. So anyway, long story short, we wound up giving a tour to Tommy Lee, and I've documented this on one of the episodes on my channel.
Yeah.
Um, and that was really cool. And I wound up being friends with the tour manager, a guy named Rich Fisher, and would see them every time they were in town for years after that. But I think that's it. If you go into a ready room,
Yeah.
these are Renaissance men and women, right? They're well educated. They're probably you know students of philosophy and the humanities. They probably play an instrument,
Mm.
or they certainly like music, and they have strong opinions about the genres that they favor. And
Right.
that's, again, the fun. Why is this? Because these are people who drink of the cup of life to its fullest,
Yeah.
and so that's the spirit. That's what kept me in for all those years, even
Yeah.
during the hard times, right? So there you go.
As Jello says, it's all about the people, right?
Well, it really
It's
is. And
and
that's kind of why my novels, the punk series, isn't about the machines as much as it's about the people.
right. And the next thing I kind of wanted to touch on, or it's kind of a side story, right? You bring up the individual tastes, but there's certain admin suite and ready room staples that will never leave the set list, right? Because me and a bunch of the bros, we were at 122's admin. I'm not sure if you had a chance to go,
I
but
did
the
not.
second
I wish
the
I'd gone.
second mist the second Mr. Brightside came on, everybody stopped what they were doing and sang as loudly as humanly possible, myself included.
Yes, yes. Well, like you said, there's some standards, right? That you know um, are timeless. I mean, when did Mr. Brightside came out in what like oh 05,
Oh
oh
four,
06,
oh
oh
four.
04? Okay, yeah. So, but it's got a cool riff. It's still so they're timeless. There's other songs from the 60s that when you start playing it's gonna get everybody going.
Right.
So I don't know why it some of those songs exist and some don't. But you gotta love it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of, like, that's the thing that I want to bring with this podcast. It's a deeper understanding of fighter culture, right? A deeper understanding of, it's not just about the flying stories. There's podcasts about the flying stories. That's not what I'm here for, right? I'm here, like, as much as I love the flying stories, don't get me wrong, it's part of what I do here, but it's not everything, right? what I want to do is expose people to a culture that I love dearly that is so misunderstood and misconstrued and mischaracterized, partly because of Hollywood, but partly because people haven't lived that life, right? And then it just leads to a better understanding of the human condition as a whole, right? Because at the end of the day, every single fighter guy I've met or gal or what have you, every single fighter bro I've met, to use the gender neutral term, bro, every single fighter dude I've ever met is completely like, they're some of the best people I know, right? They're people that, frankly, I love all my bros dearly. I was talking to one of the current active duty Hornet guys yesterday, and we were like, going back to music for a second. Van's Warp Tour is going to be coming back, but under Live Nation in 25, or at least that's what the rumor is saying, right? And I said to him, I'm like, dude, if they swing a California date, you bet your ass I'm spending money. I forget about Tailhook. If I can't make Tailhook, we're going to Warp Tour. And if I can't make Warp Tour, we are going to come to Hook 25 and spend the entire weekend bitching about how we didn't go to Warp Tour. Right? So,
Yep.
it's part of the culture where, people, for me as someone with disability, I found a place where, nobody gives a shit. Nobody sees it. I'm one of the bros and I'm treated absolutely no differently.
Well, you've earned that though. That's rare. That's you. And I think you. It's funny you point out what the mission of your podcast is, and I think you're uniquely positioned to be the interpreter in those ways. Because people on the inside are too close to it, and people, as you say, on the outside are just it's something they just know about through TV and movies, and therefore they're not going to get it right. So this is the service that you provide uniquely with what you're doing.
Or the occasional news scandal.
Yeah, well,
Like,
that too, and those are always disappointing in terms of the way that they're
yeah,
covered or they're mangled or whatever, right? And don't get me
right.
going about that.
But I want to switch gears here and talk a bit more about a meta conversation between me and you on just for a couple minutes here. The highs and lows of content creation. For anybody who's thinking about getting into content creation, this is going to be us discussing for 5 to 10 minutes, the highs and lows, what to do, what not to do, and some of the leadership lessons we've acquired along the way, some of the lessons that we are going to give to our audience just as a general rule, right? Because that's something that I think that a lot of people could benefit from.
Another great question. So I fell into this content creation world through sort of happenstance. It's there's no pipeline, as you know, and so I think the
Yeah,
first thing people who aspire to do it need to understand is there's no right way. There are some best practices, but the bottom line is when you say you want to start a podcast, you want to be an actor, you want to go to Broadway, you want to write a novel, what you're saying is, I'm going to trade on the vagaries of public taste and try to make a living out of it. So that's a bumpy, rough ride. Just
right,
understand that. Okay, so that's part A. Because I come from a world where it's very structured, and generally the path to success is well defined.
right,
That's sort of a generalization. But when you get out of the Navy and you're like, okay, now I'm going to be a novelist, or now I'm going to have a podcast like Jello, or now I'm going to be an actor like a lot of vets in who hang around Hollywood, you
right.
know, or have been like my classmate Terry Dietz was on Survivor a couple of times,
And
or
dogfights.
what's that?
And the TV show Dogfights, which is part of my
Yep,
childhood.
exactly, right. And so you got Terry Dietz, you got John Foley, you got these guys who have become kind of media personalities, leveraging their military pedigree to do so.
Right,
Okay, so I I retired after 20 years teaching at the Naval Academy, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to just do some boring day job, right? That was like the worst thing to me, that the idea of, I'll just say it. I didn't want to work for a defense contractor,
Yeah.
being biz dev, because I wasn't an engineer. So I'm either going to be in the marketing or sales side of it, and, hanging out at the convention in the booth and handing out footballs and squeeze toys and posters and t-shirts. That struck me as just what a drag. Okay, so I fought that. Now my first job was working at the V-22 program down at Pax River at NavAir.
Yeah.
I was made aware of that job by my brother, who just retired from NavAir. Um, and the V-22 program needed a PAO, which I wasn't technically a PAO, but they wanted somebody aggressive. So they sort of melded my writing with my aviation logbook and said, okay, you're now the PAO for the V-22. I needed a day job because I was under contract to Penguin Putnam to write more punk novels.
Mm.
So I just viewed this as, okay, this will just pay the bills while I'm waiting to be a famous author, right? Because Punk's War had come out, it had done pretty well. We had a deal with now a New York house. Looked like everything was going to happen and I was going to be the next Tom Clancy. All right. So, that's not how it went, through factors outside of my control. And so I met, in the meantime, the founder of military.com, the website, the biggest military website in the country to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And as a function of that, I got hired to be the editor of military.com. So now I left my job at NavAir, didn't
Mm-hmm.
move from Southern Maryland, but was working in San Francisco, which is where military.com was headquartered at that time. And so that became an education like no other. I was thrown into the deep end. It was challenging. It wasn't always fun, but I got good at it. These are the days before social media, right as social media was coming into the equation. Blogs were coming into the equation. So I was at the forefront of, how do we do digital media? And so that taught me a lot. And it turns out I was pretty good at it. So along the way, I started to get good at doing visual media. And when you say visual media, what's the platform that is the biggest among the options? Is YouTube.
Yeah.
And so I have a YouTube mentor, a guy named Rick Beato, who is a music YouTuber. He has, millions of subscribers. He's turned out to be one of my best friends. We talk on a near daily basis.
Yeah.
And so he gave me the sort of, here's the roadmap, and now you go do. And, it turned out to be kind of a big channel. And it became so big that I quit my job at the Naval Institute because I couldn't afford to work a day job. It wasn't even a choice,
Yeah.
you know? Okay. So that's what got me to be a YouTuber. Now, just like, on any given episode, you're starting from scratch.
Right.
Okay. So you have to accept, because when I hit 1 million views, like on the Carroll episode, you could fall into the trap of thinking, well, okay, now every episode I'm going to have 1 million views. That's not how it goes.
Mm.
It's not up to you. My responsibility is to make the best possible episode I can and then launch it. And then the world decides what they're going to do with it,
Yeah.
And so that's my best advice, Mad Dog, to content creators is, your job is focus on the content, do the
Yeah.
work. And that includes, in my case, post-production, which is where the magic happens.
Right.
It's not just you and me talking and then I post it. Some other aviation YouTubers do that. Mine is, okay, we talk. And then if you mention an airplane, I'll show B-roll or an image of the airplane. And I will
Yeah.
identify you with a lower third. And I will cut away to my 2 cents or whatever. You make it an arc of a narrative, not just some organic conversation that maybe doesn't go anywhere. So that's work, right?
Mm. Yeah.
I do live streams.
Yeah.
occasionally. That's sort of an exception. But mostly I'm doing produced episodes.
Yeah.
So I'm a golfer. So the golfer's responsibility is keep your head still and put a good swing on it.
Right.
Then it's up to the gods where the ball goes, right? The wind picks up, a bird grabs it, you hit a squirrel, a tree branch. It's
Yeah.
not up to you. Your
No.
responsibility is put a good swing on it. So that's the same with a content creator in YouTube or wherever, Google Play or Instagram, Facebook. Your responsibility, even if you're talking about a 10-second snippet, is to make it the best possible content. And then you launch it, and then other people decide what happens. And so it's taken me a long time to come to terms with the idea that it's not up to you. I
Yeah.
mean, there are some that I think are going to be smash hits. I thought my visit to Truman was going to do better than it's done. It
Mm.
has about 150,000 views, which for me is not awesome. You
Mm.
know, my interview with Chowda Hill from last week is at about 70. That's way below what I thought it would get based on his social media popularity, that he earned during the last deployment.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty good number. But and I'm like, okay, whatever. I'm very happy with the episode. It's just doing what it's doing. So is it the thumbnail? Is it the title? Is it the whatever? You can tweak some of these things, but at the end of all of that, it either is going to resonate or not. And so you got to
Yeah.
just press on, keep going, right? So learn from the results, fuse them back into the editorial choices you make after that. But if you start to freak out because of low numbers, you're going to run screaming from being a content creator in short order.
That's literally my philosophy in a nutshell, right? I'm not doing this for the numbers, right? The numbers are going to come eventually. I do not care. It's the journey is the journey, right? But I'm doing this partly as a history major myself to preserve the history, right? In the case of Viz and Scar's dad specifically, right? I did that episode because Vic has so many great stories. Shout out to Vic. Love the guy. He's one of my best friends. Um, but I'm doing it because I want to preserve that history, that culture, a culture that might be under threat from unmanned systems within the next 50 years, despite years of people proving that wrong over the last century of air-to-air combat. Regardless, right? You get my point. Like, it's the point is, the views are so secondary to actually preserving the history and the stories, for lack of a better term.
Right. No, so then you'll never be disappointed, right? You're
Exactly.
focused on your charter, your mission statement, and
Yeah.
then, like you said, everything else will follow if you're doing that to the best of your ability. That's a great stance to have.
Yeah. Anyways, Mooch, we've been going at it for, wow, an hour. We're 8 minutes off the perfect number. For those who know, they know. Um, so in closing, we kind of touched on what you're doing now, the YouTube content creation stuff. What I want to close with is your call sign story. Who came up with Mooch? Where does it come from? And is it cemented in and the last add-on question to that is it cemented in stone because you've had combat time? Are there times where you ever had a thought where, oh, I might get renamed? Like, how did that go?
So my first like meta call sign when I arrived at VF32, because you don't get one in the training command
No.
or the RAG, right? Maybe
Right.
something obligatory based on your name.
Yeah.
Um, I think somebody was calling me Christmas because my last name's Carroll.
Hmm.
But you get to the squadron and you're just the FNG. So my first, and this was given to me by the XO, um, was Stork because I'm tall, skinny, and he was a huge Animal House fan. So he kept saying, Stork's a dork. So that was
Yeah.
it, right? So I'm Stork. And then we got to our first port call, which was Palma in the Med. and I didn't have any money.
Right.
And so we'd be at a bar or something, and they'd go, "Hey, Stork, it's your round." I'd be like, "I don't have any money." And so Fuji Lansdale
Yeah.
pointed across the table and said, "You're a mooch," and that's all it took.
That's
So
it.
at that point, everybody just kind of had this aha moment, and that was it. So that was my name for the next 16, 17 years. That the channel has resurrected, by the way. But it's a source of pride. It's like Bono or Cher. Nobody knows what your last name is. It's just your identity. There's so much more into that when somebody
Yeah.
calls you by your call sign. So to get it changed after that, you have to do something really,
Stupid.
well, stupid, dubious, noteworthy. Um, and so obviously I didn't do anything. I mean, I did some stupid things, but I didn't do anything to the degree that it changed my call sign. So there you go. Usually when you get one, it's yours for the duration.
Yeah.
And if even when you do something stupid, it maybe is a asterisk or somebody calls you that in some circumstances, but your official one is what it is. And
Yeah.
you become a franchise, everybody knows you. And it's when we go to places like Tailhook, uh, and people call me by my call sign that knew me back in the day, it just feels really good.
Yeah. Like literally all my contacts, all my bros across both sides of the border, it's just call sign and last name. You don't
Yep.
even need a first name, right? Like,
No.
no, you don't.
And in
But
many cases, you might not even know what it is.
yeah, and and it's funny because Mad Dog was kind of self-given. Then the Canadian Hornet. Here's where I'm in a bit of a pickle, Mooch. So Mad Dog was kind of self-given because it works with my last name. My last name is McPhee, right? Play on my last name, simple enough, right? Kind of self-given. The Canadian Hornet Bros just roll with it, right? Because we're kind of chill about that. Typical Canadians, right? Um, and then I roll into Tail Hook 23, my first in person hook where we first met. And VMFA 314 abandons me. I think they ate one too many crayons, but regardless, you get my point. Um, and 41, VFA 41, first to fight, first to strike. Sorry, had to say it. I'm an unofficial honorary member. I have to say it every time I open my mouth. Um, they rescued me from that, for lack of a better term, right? And we
Yep.
roll into the admin, okay, and Mr. Brightside comes on. And being me, I'm wearing a shirt of one of my favorite artists. She just released a debut record today. Um, I'm very much a scene kid. I grew up with Green Day, Blink, Sum 41, all that stuff, right? And so naturally, I belt out Mr. Brightside as loudly as humanly possible, right? Because I have to, right? And my buddy Little Boy turns to me and he's like, okay, starting now, you're scene kid, but like the SpongeBob mocking font where one letter is capitalized, one is lowercase, you know how it works, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So my dilemma here, I want you to settle this for me before we go. My dilemma here is, do I go with the Canadian call sign? Do I go with the call sign that 41 gave me? Like I'm stuck in a
It's whatever people call you. It's not really up to you, right? It's
exactly,
whatever people call you. So it becomes a de facto reality, and then you just accept it. So
right?
I think the short answer is you're Mad Dog to most of us. And then maybe in some other situations, uh, you're the other one, the SpongeBob one, or whatever you're calling it,
Scene kid.
the Klepto kid.
uh,
Yeah, it's not even up to you, right?
no.
So it's not even worth worrying about.
Plus I got the name tag done, so it's basically set in stone. So
Okay, that's another reality. Sure,
all right, Mooch. This has been a lot of fun. I'm guessing we'll see each other at Hook 25. We'll have another blast. Um,
absolutely.
it's been a hell of a lot of fun. This is Shop Talk with Mad Dog, episode 10 with Ward, Mooch, Carroll. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this. We are signing off.